When I first moved into that little house on Sycamore Street, I didn't think much about the neighbors. I'd wanted peace and quiet, a place away from the city, and my new place was perfect for that. It was small but cozy, with a little garden out front and a nice porch for coffee in the morning. Everything seemed ideal, except for one strange thing. My neighbor, Mr. Harris. I first noticed him on the day I moved in. He was standing in his yard, just staring at me. He was an old man with a thin frame and hair so gray it was almost white. His skin looked pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in ages, and he had these cold, narrow eyes that seemed to follow me everywhere. I remember feeling a chill run down my spine when our eyes met. He didn't wave or smile, just stared, his face blank but intense, as if he was studying me. At first I thought maybe he's just one of those unfriendly types. Some people just aren't that friendly, right? I could live with that. I mean, it's not like I moved here to make friends. But as days passed, I started to notice that he wasn't just unfriendly. There was something off about him. The first night in my new house was when things started to get really strange. I had just finished unpacking a few boxes, and I was exhausted. I turned off the lights, crawled into bed, and closed my eyes, hoping for a good night's sleep. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound coming from Mr. Harris's house. It sounded like scratching. Faint at first, but then louder. It was like something or someone was scratching at the walls. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. I kept telling myself it was probably just an animal, or maybe a tree branch brushing against his house. But the sound continued, steady and rhythmic, like claws scraping wood. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. New houses have weird noises, I told myself. It's nothing. But when I went outside, I saw Mr. Harris standing in his yard again, watching me. This time, there was a strange look in his eyes, like he knew something I didn't. He didn't say a word, didn't smile or nod, just stared. Over the next few days, the strange sounds from his house didn't stop. Every night, around the same time, I'd hear the scratching, sometimes followed by a low rumbling noise, almost like a growl. It was impossible to sleep. I would lie there, clutching my blanket, listening, wondering what was going on next door. One night, curiosity got the best of me. I decided to take a closer look. I crept to my window, careful not to make any noise, and peered out at Mr. Harris's house. His lights were on, but his curtains were drawn tight. Shadows moved behind them, long and strange, almost inhuman. I couldn't make out what was causing them, but they were there, shifting and flickering like something alive. Then, out of nowhere, I saw him, the outline of Mr. Harris's face, right up against the window, staring directly at me. It was like he knew I was watching him. I gasped and stumbled back, my heart racing. I didn't go near that window for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was just tired, stressed from the move, and letting my mind play tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was wrong with Mr. Harris, something I couldn't quite explain, but I felt it every time I saw him. One afternoon, a few weeks after I'd moved in, I decided to go for a walk. It was a sunny day, and I needed some fresh air to clear my mind. As I walked down the street, I noticed some of the other neighbors staring at me, whispering to each other. I didn't think much of it at first, but then a woman approached me. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder as if she was afraid someone might be watching. "Are you new here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded. "Yes, I just moved in a few weeks ago." She glanced over at Mr. Harris's house, her face pale. "Be careful," she said, her voice trembling. "Stay away from him." "Mr. Harris?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. She nodded, looking around nervously. "There are rumors about him. People say he's not normal." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and hurried away, leaving me standing there, confused and more than a little frightened. That night, the scratching started again, louder than before. It felt like it was coming from inside my own walls, like whatever was in Mr. Harris's house was trying to get into mine. I lay there, frozen, listening to the sound inch closer and closer. And then I heard a new sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth outside my window. I wanted to look, to see who or what was out there, but I was too scared. I stayed in bed, my eyes squeezed shut, hoping it would go away. The footsteps stopped after what felt like an eternity, and the scratching faded into silence. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the local library, hoping to find some information about Mr. Harris or his house. I spent hours digging through old newspapers and records, but there was nothing about him. It was as if he didn't exist, like he'd appeared out of nowhere. But then I found something. An old article from nearly 20 years ago about a man who had lived in the same house. The man had disappeared without a trace, and no one had ever seen him again. The article mentioned strange noises, neighbors hearing scratching sounds at night, and rumors about the man's obsession with dark rituals. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the article. Could it be that Mr. Harris was somehow connected to this? Was he the same man, or had he somehow taken the place of the one who disappeared? When I got home, I saw Mr. Harris standing in his yard, watching me with that same cold, unblinking stare. This time, there was a hint of a smile on his face, like he knew I'd been digging into his past. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept hearing the scratching, the growling, and the footsteps outside my window. And this time, I knew it wasn't my imagination. Mr. Harris was more than just an odd neighbor. He was something else, something dark and dangerous. After finding that article in the library, I knew I couldn't ignore the strange things happening in my new neighborhood anymore. Mr. Harris was hiding something sinister. But what was it? And what was he doing every night to make those noises? The next evening, as the sun was setting, I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and to be honest, I'd already become nervous about any surprises in this place. I peered through the peephole and saw the woman who had warned me before, the one who had told me to stay away from Mr. Harris. She looked around nervously, glancing over her shoulder before knocking again. I opened the door a crack, just enough to speak to her. "Hi," I whispered. "What's going on?" She leaned in, her eyes wide and urgent. "You need to leave. Tonight, if you can." "Leave?" I asked, my heart racing. "Why?" It's him, Mr. Harris. He isn't what he seems." Her voice was barely a whisper, and she glanced over her shoulder as if she was worried he could somehow hear us from his own house. "He's done something terrible. They say that takes people, and those who go missing are never seen." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean takes people?" She shook her head, her face pale. "No one knows exactly, but every few years someone in this neighborhood disappears, and every time he's seen watching them, studying them. Then one day, they're just gone. No one asks questions, and no one talks about it. They're too afraid." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Was this why the house had been so cheap? Did the real estate agents know about Mr. Harris and his habits? "Why hasn't anyone done anything about it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They tried once, years ago. A group of neighbors went to his house one night, but only one of them came back, and he was changed. He never spoke about what happened, and a month later, he disappeared too. Since then, everyone's just learned to stay away from him. But you. You're new, and he's noticed you." I swallowed hard, fear gripping me. "What should I do?" "Leave," she repeated, her voice full of urgency. "Leave, before he decides it's your turn." I wanted to listen to her advice, I really did. But it wasn't that simple. I'd just moved here, signed a lease, and spent all my savings. I couldn't just pack up and leave. I told myself that maybe it was just a rumor, a spooky story to scare newcomers. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, making sure every single one was secure. But despite my precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that Mr. Harris was watching me. I kept the lights on and tried to distract myself by reading, but the words blurred on the page, my mind constantly drifting back to the noises I'd heard at night. Around midnight, I heard it again, the scratching. It was coming from his house, loud and insistent. I froze, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way out. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. There was a long pause, a moment of silence so heavy it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. And then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, making their way across my yard. I didn't dare look out the window. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, as the footsteps came closer and closer, stopping right outside my front door. I could hear his breathing now, slow and heavy, almost like an animal. My heart was racing, and I squeezed my eyes shut, praying he would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally retreated, I stayed frozen in place, not daring to move until the sun began to rise. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on, what Mr. Harris was hiding. I waited until dusk, until I was sure he'd left his house, and then I slipped out of mine and crossed into his yard. His house looked even more sinister up close, the windows dark and lifeless, the paint peeling in places. My hands shook as I tried the back door, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed it open, wincing as it creaked, and stepped inside. The air was thick and musty, and the whole place had a strange, decaying smell, like something rotting. I moved through the dark hallway, my footsteps silent on the worn carpet, and made my way toward the basement door, where I thought I'd heard the scratching sounds coming from. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I took a deep breath and turned it, opening the door to reveal a steep, dark staircase leading down into pitch blackness. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but something drove me forward. I stepped carefully down the stairs, my hand trailing along the cold, damp wall. The smell grew stronger, almost overpowering as I descended. When I reached the bottom, I fumbled for a light switch, and finally, my fingers found a small, old lamp. I turned it on, and the weak light illuminated the basement. My stomach twisted as I took in the sight around me. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted in a dark, reddish-brown color. There were shelves filled with jars, each one containing something that looked suspiciously like bones. Small ones, large ones, some that looked almost human. And in the corner of the room, I saw a large wooden crate. The scratching sounds had come from here, I was sure of it. My hands shaking, I walked over to it and pried open the lid. Inside was a small, battered journal, covered in dust and old stains. I opened it carefully, and the pages were filled with strange writings, drawings of things I couldn't understand. But one page caught my eye, a list of names, all written in a careful, steady hand. I recognized some of them. They were the names of people who had disappeared from this neighborhood. My name was the last one on the list. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard footsteps above me, slow and steady. Mr. Harris was home. Panic gripped me, and I quickly closed the journal, putting it back in the crate. I turned off the light and backed toward the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, and I knew he was heading for the basement. I had no choice. I ran up the stairs, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Just as I reached the top, I heard the basement door open behind me. I didn't look back. I just ran, sprinting out of his house and across the yard to mine. I locked the door behind me and pressed my back against it, breathing heavily. But I knew I wasn't safe. I could hear his footsteps approaching my house, slow and deliberate, like he was savoring the fear that radiated from me. He stopped outside my door, and I heard him whisper my name, his voice low and chilling. "I know you're in there," he said. "I know you've seen everything." Terror gripped me, and I knew I had to get out. I grabbed my phone and dialed, my fingers shaking so much I could barely press the buttons. But as soon as the operator picked up, the line went dead. A moment later, there was a loud banging on the door. Mr. Harris was trying to get in. I backed away, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. The banging grew louder, and I could see the door shaking, the wood splintering under the force of his blows. Just as he was about to break through, I remembered the back door. I sprinted through the house, flinging the door open and running as fast as I could down the street, not stopping until I was far away from Sycamore Street, from Mr. Harris, from that horrible house. I never went back to that neighborhood. I didn't even return for my things. I filed a police report, but when they investigated, they found nothing. No strange symbols, no jars, no journal. It was as if Mr. Harris had known I would come, as if he'd been waiting for it, and had hidden all the evidence the moment I left. But every once in a while, when I'm alone at night, I still hear the scratching. And sometimes, just for a moment, I see a shadowy figure outside my window, watching me with cold, narrow eyes. And I know deep down that Mr. Harris is still out there, waiting, watching, and that someday he'll come for me again. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew each other, and the mornings were peaceful with the scent of fresh-cut grass and the sound of birds chirping. I had just moved in, a single woman, hoping for a fresh start after a difficult year. The house was old but charming, nestled between two others in a row of identical homes. My neighbor to the left was Mrs. Thompson. She was an older woman, maybe in her late 60s, always wearing long dark dresses, even in the summer heat. She had a strange way of looking at people, as if she was studying them, but I never thought much of it. Some people are just like that, I assume. The other neighbor, the one to the right, was a man named Mark. He was younger, perhaps in his 30s, with short brown hair and a friendly smile. He had an odd collection of books, mostly old horror novels, and he often invited me over for tea, which I accepted. We would talk about life and laugh, and he was easy to be around. But Mrs. Thompson? I had never exchanged more than a few polite words with her. She kept to herself, always inside her house, curtains drawn tight. Occasionally, I would hear strange noises from her place, a loud thumping or scraping, but I brushed it off as old house sound. One night, as I was preparing for bed, there was a loud knock on my door. I opened it cautiously to find Mrs. Thompson standing there. She looked pale, almost sickly, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Please, I need help." I was taken aback but nodded and stepped aside. She entered, her presence seeming to fill the room with an unsettling chill. "I've seen things," she whispered, looking over her shoulder nervously. "Things that are not normal. I think he's watching me." "Who?" I asked, confused. "Mark," she said, her voice cracking. "Mark is not who he says he is." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Mark was always so kind, so friendly. Why would she say such a thing? "He's not what he appears to be," she repeated. "He's dangerous." I didn't know what to think. Mrs. Thompson's eyes darted around the room as if expecting Mark to appear at any moment. Her breathing grew heavier, and she grabbed my arm. "He's been watching me for weeks," she continued. "I see him late at night, standing at my window. I hear him whispering my name. He's trying to get I felt a knot form in my stomach. I wanted to tell her it was just her imagination, that maybe she was sleep-deprived or scared, but something in her eyes made me hesitate. "Are you sure?" I asked. She nodded vigorously. "He's not normal. He's been living next door, but he's not human. He can change. He can." Suddenly, there was a loud crash from outside, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Mrs. Thompson gasped and stumbled backward, her face pale as she grabbed my hand. "He's here," she whispered. "You have to hide. He'll come for you next." Before I could respond, there was a knock on the door. I froze, my heart pounding. I slowly walked to the door and opened it just a crack. It was Mark, standing there with his usual smile. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm and friendly. I couldn't speak. Mrs. Thompson's warnings echoed in my mind. Was he really dangerous? Was he something else? Mark raised an eyebrow when he saw the fear in my eyes. "What's going on?" he asked, his smile fading slightly. "Nothing," I stammered. "Just a little tired." "All right," he said, still smiling. "Well, if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." He turned and walked away, his footsteps growing fainter as he went back to his house. I shut the door and turned to Mrs. Thompson, who had backed away to the corner of the room, shaking. "See?" she whispered. "I told you." I didn't know what to believe. Mark seemed like the same person he always was, but Mrs. Thompson's fear was palpable, and her warnings felt real. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Mrs. Thompson had said. Was Mark truly dangerous, or was she just an old woman, imagining things? I tossed and turned in bed. The thought of him standing at my window, watching me, gnawing at my mind. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I went to Mark's house to talk to him. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I stepped inside, calling his name, but the house was eerily silent. It was dark, the curtains drawn tight, even though it was midday. I could smell something strange, something metallic, like blood. I slowly walked through the house, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. As I reached the kitchen, my breath caught in my throat. There, on the counter, were several books. Books I recognized from Mark's collection. But this wasn't what shocked me. The pages of the books were torn out, and the walls were covered in strange, cryptic writing. It looked like a mix of symbols, ancient texts, and something that resembled claw marks. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, a soft shuffle of footsteps. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just as I was about to turn back to leave, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I whirled around to find Mark standing behind me, his face expressionless. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice low. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. His eyes were dark, the warm, friendly smile from before gone. Sue. I couldn't find the words. Mark didn't speak again. Instead, he just stared at me with those dark, empty eyes. I took a step backward, then another, until I was at the door. Before I could escape, he spoke. "I warned you," he said in a whisper. "You shouldn't have listened to her." I ran out of the house, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I was back at my own house, locked safely inside. But even as I sat there trying to catch my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was watching me. I could almost feel his eyes on me, through the walls, through the windows. Days passed, and I didn't leave the house. Mrs. Thompson, too, had become more reclusive. I never saw her again, and I didn't dare check on her, afraid of what I might find. Then one night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft knock on my door. My heart stopped. Slowly, I got up and walked to the door. When I opened it, there was no one there. But on the ground in front of me was a single old book. It was Mark's book, the one with the torn pages. I bent down to pick it up, my hands trembling. As I opened the cover, I found something written inside, in blood. "He's watching you." I stood frozen in the doorway, the book heavy in my hands. The words inside sent a chill down my spine. "He's watching you." I didn't know whether to scream or run. My thoughts raced, and every corner of the room felt like it was closing in on me. I stepped back, looking around in a panic. The night was eerily still, with no sounds from outside, no crickets, no wind rustling the trees, just silence. The book felt too cold in my hands, like it was absorbing the warmth from my fingers. Suddenly, I heard it. A sound coming from next door, a scraping noise like something dragging across the floor. I froze again, heart pounding. I had heard this before, often, late at night. But this time, it was different. It was louder, more deliberate. Without thinking, I stepped out into the hallway and went to the window. My breath caught when I saw Mark's house. It was dark, the windows tightly shut, just like every other night. But something about it felt wrong. There was no movement inside, no lights flickering on or off, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to calm myself, but every instinct screamed that I needed to leave. That very moment, a loud thud came from inside Mark's house, followed by a long, drawn-out scraping sound. I gasped, backing away from the window. The doorbell rang. I stumbled backward, my body frozen in fear. The doorbell echoed through the house. Who could it be? My mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made sense. It wasn't late enough for anyone to be visiting, and yet, here was this sound at this hour, a clear warning that I was not alone. I slowly walked toward the door, trying to steady my breathing. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I hesitated. There was no way I was answering it. I had seen too much already, and the last thing I wanted was to let whoever or whatever was out there in. Then, I heard something else. A voice. Faint at first, but clear as it grew louder. "Let me in." The voice was deep, almost hypnotic. It sounded like Mark, but it wasn't quite him. It was a hollow echo of him, like it was being forced through some dark, twisted filter. The words repeated, each one more insistent than the last. "Let me in." I stepped back from the door, eyes wide, and my body trembling. Was it him? Was it some kind of sick game? Or was it something else entirely? The scraping noise grew louder again, as though something or someone was moving around in the walls. I backed away from the door, feeling the tension rise. I wasn't safe, not here, not with him. I ran to the phone and tried to call the police, but the line was dead. I felt the blood drain from my face. How had the phone line been cut? I didn't hear anyone come near the house. The terror I had been trying to ignore flooded back heavier now. Then came a soft knock on the door. I flinched. Knock, knock, knock. Each one felt like a hammer to my chest, reverberating through my entire body. "Let me in," the voice repeated. It wasn't Mark anymore. The voice sounded distorted, unnatural, as though something had taken over him, possessed him, and it was now trying to get to me. I couldn't breathe. My head spun. I had to get out of the house, but the door was the only exit. The window. No, the ground outside was too high and I couldn't risk jumping. I thought about running into the woods behind my house, but that would mean walking right past Mark's house, whatever was inside there. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around to find Mrs. Thompson standing behind me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with the same terror I had seen before. She looked different now, more haggard, her dark dress hanging loosely on her frail body, as though she had been through something terrible. Her skin looked too pale, like death had already taken her. "You shouldn't have opened it," she whispered, her voice low and raspy. "He's coming. He's already—" "What?" I gasped, backing away from her. Who? But Mrs. Thompson didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes vacant, as if she were lost in another world. Her mouth trembled, and she took a step toward me, slowly, as though she were dragging herself through water. The doorbell rang again, louder this time. Bang! It was the sound of something smashing against the door. I turned to see the door shaking on its hinges. I knew what was on the other side, but I couldn't stop myself from moving closer. I reached for the handle, my fingers numb with fear. The handle turned, slowly. There was nothing I could do to stop it. The door flew open with a violent crash. But it wasn't Mark anymore. His face was twisted, eyes black as coal. His skin was pale, stretched thin like it couldn't contain whatever was inside him. His mouth hung open, and a dark liquid dripped from his lips. Blood, or something worse. Behind him, I saw the outline of something moving, a shadow that flickered, stretching like it was breathing. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, the shape lunged forward, and before I could scream, it reached me. I turned and tried to run, but Mrs. Thompson grabbed my arm with a strength that felt unnatural. Her nails dug into my skin as though she was trying to pull me back. Her eyes locked with mine, and I could see nothing but despair and madness in them. "You should have listened," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's not just your neighbor. He's been waiting for—" The world around me began to spin, and I felt the air grow heavier. I looked toward Mark, no, whatever he was now, and felt the darkness closing in. I couldn't escape. There was no place to run. As the shadow enveloped me, the last thing I heard was Mrs. Thompson's voice, soft, like a memory fading into the night. "He's been here all along." The darkness swallowed me whole, and I felt myself falling into an endless abyss where every breath was harder to take. The air felt thick, like I was drowning in it. I couldn't see anything, just an overwhelming sensation of cold and weight pressing down on me from every side. My heart pounded in my chest, and I gasped for air that didn't seem to exist. Then there was a flicker of light, a sliver of something familiar, the shape of a door. I reached toward it, desperate to escape. But as my hand touched the frame, I felt a cold, clammy grip tighten around my wrist. I turned to see Mrs. Thompson's face, pale and distorted, her eyes wide with madness. "You can't leave," she whispered. "You're already part of—" I screamed, but no sound came out. I tried to pull away, but her grip was too strong. My vision blurred, the edges of my consciousness starting to fade. I felt like I was being torn in two, caught between the world I knew and this dark, suffocating place where the rules of reality no longer applied. "Help!" I tried to shout, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. Just then, I heard a deep, growling voice from the shadows behind me. It was Mark, or whatever he had become. His voice was low and guttural, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "You should have stayed away," he said. "But now, you belong to me." I felt a strange weight pressing against my chest. Something was crawling inside me, coiling through my veins, wrapping around my heart. I gasped, unable to move, as I realized what had happened. I was trapped. Not just in this strange place, but in Mark's world, the world he had created, the world where nothing was as it seemed. I heard a loud crack, the sound of bones snapping. Mrs. Thompson's body twisted and jerked as though something inside her was breaking free. She screamed, a shrill, inhuman sound that filled the air with pain and terror. Then everything went silent. The world around me shifted. The door in front of me began to open slowly, and I took a cautious step forward. The light beyond it was dim, like the twilight before the dawn. I squinted, trying to make sense of what was happening, but everything felt wrong. The light flickered, and I saw Mark standing in front of me again, but his face was different. His eyes were still black, but now there was something more, something that wasn't human at all. "Welcome to my world," he said with a twisted grin. "You were never meant to—" In an instant, The room began to warp around me. The walls seemed to close in, and the air thickened. I reached for the door, but it slammed shut before I could escape. I was no longer in my house. I wasn't even sure where I was. All I knew was that I was trapped. Mark, or whatever had taken over his body, was now the ruler of this place, and I, like Mrs. Thompson before me, had become part of it. The darkness was no longer something I could fight against. It was a part of me now, a shadow that followed me, a weight that clung to my soul. And as I took my first steps into this new, twisted reality, I realized the horrifying truth. I had become just another one of his neighbors, another victim lost to the darkness. The door that had once led to my house was now just another entryway into his domain. I was never getting out. I remember the day my family and I moved into that quiet little house. We had left behind the noise and chaos of the city, hoping for a peaceful life. It was supposed to be our fresh start. Our home was small but cozy, with a neat garden and a little white fence. We were so eager to meet our new neighbors and settle into this tranquil neighborhood. For the first few days, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors waved as they passed by, and the air smelled of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. My wife Sarah and I felt that we had made the right choice for us and our 10-year-old daughter, Lily. But one thing kept nagging at me from the start. The house next door didn't feel quite right. It looked ordinary at first. 2 stories with a plain brick exterior and a patchy lawn that clearly hadn't seen a mower in a while. The windows were always dark, covered by thick, heavy curtains, even in the middle of the day. There was something about that house that seemed wrong. Then, one evening, I saw him for the first time. I was taking out the trash when a movement caught my eye. Across the yard, a man stepped out of the house next door. He was tall, painfully thin, with a face as pale as if he hadn't seen the sun in years. He didn't look at me, didn't look at anything at all. He just stood there on his porch, staring off into the distance like he was deep in thought, or maybe listening to something I couldn't hear. It sent a shiver through me. I stood frozen, watching him. Then, without warning, he turned and went back inside, closing the door softly behind him. The whole encounter lasted barely 10 seconds, but it left me feeling uneasy. When I told Sarah, she laughed it off. "Maybe he's just shy," she said. "Not everyone likes meeting the neighbor." "Maybe," I said, but a knot of discomfort had settled in my stomach that I couldn't quite shake. A few nights later, I was reading in the living room when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. I sat up, my book slipping from my hands. The sound was soft but persistent, like someone gently knocking on a window. I turned my head, and my heart began to race. The sound was coming from the window directly behind me. Taking a slow, shaky breath, I reached for the curtain. I pulled it back, just enough to peek out. There, just inches away from me, stood the man from next door. His face was pressed close to the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight at me. His skin was almost gray, and his eyes seemed hollow, empty of any warmth or humanity. I staggered back, letting the curtain fall shut. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears as I stumbled back. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, coming into the room with a puzzled look. The neighbor," I stammered, pointing at the window. He's outside." Sarah pulled the curtain open and looked out, but there was no one there. She turned back to me with a half smile, her eyes gentle but slightly amused. "There's nobody there, honey. You probably just imagined it." I shook my head, but she was right. The man was gone. The yard was empty, silent, bathed in the pale glow of the street lamp. But I knew what I'd seen. I didn't imagine it. I'd felt his eyes on me, so close I could almost feel his cold breath through the glass. After that night, things got worse. I started noticing small, strange things around our house. Objects would go missing only to reappear in odd places. A pair of scissors vanished from the kitchen counter, only to turn up in the backyard days later, half buried in the dirt. Lily's toys would be moved, arranged in strange patterns on the living room floor. Sarah insisted it was Lily playing tricks, but Lily swore she didn't do it. One evening, I found muddy footprints leading up to our front door. They were too large to be from any of us, and they stopped right at the doorstep, as if someone had been standing there waiting. Then came the whispering. It started one night after everyone had gone to bed. I was lying in the dark, my mind drifting between sleep and wakefulness, when I heard it, a soft, raspy whisper, barely audible. I sat up, straining my ears, but the whispering stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind in the silence of the night. But the next night, it happened again. The whispers were closer this time, almost at my bedroom door. I could hear them murmuring, words I couldn't quite understand, like a language I'd never heard before. I finally told Sarah everything. I told her about the man, the missing objects, the footprints, the whispers. She listened patiently, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "You've been under a lot of stress," she said gently. "Maybe we just need some rest. This move has been hard on all of us." I didn't argue. I wanted to believe she was right. A few nights later, something happened that neither of us could explain. It was late. I was drifting off when a noise jolted me awake. It was Lily screaming. Sarah and I rushed to her room, my heart hammering with fear. We found her sitting up in bed, wide-eyed, tears streaming down her face. "He was in my room," she sobbed, pointing to the window. "He was outside, looking at me through the glass." I ran to the window and yanked back the curtain, but there was no one there. The yard was empty, the street quiet, but the look on Lily's face told me she had seen him, just like I had. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable. The next day, I called the police. They came, took my statement, and checked the yard, but they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone lurking around. They told me there wasn't much they could do without evidence. They suggested it was a case of nerves, that the stress of the move was getting to us. But I knew the truth. I knew someone was watching us, someone who didn't want us there. That night, as I lay awake, I heard the whispers again. This time, they were louder, clearer, as if someone was right outside my door. "Get out," the voice hissed. "Get out." A cold chill washed over me. I sat up, heart pounding, and went to check the locks, double-checking each window and door. But as I turned back to head upstairs, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man was standing in our hallway, staring at me with those empty, soulless eyes. I don't remember how long we stared at each other. It could have been seconds, it felt like hours. Then slowly, he raised one bony finger and pointed. Upstairs. A scream caught in my throat as I ran back upstairs, calling for Sarah and Lily. I grabbed them both and locked us in the bedroom, my hands shaking as I called the police again. When they arrived, they found no sign of the man. But I knew what I had seen. I knew he had been there, in my house, watching us. The next morning, we packed our bags and left. We never went back to that house. We never spoke to the neighbors, never learned who the man was or what he wanted. But I still see him in my nightmares, standing in the shadows, watching, waiting.